The crunch of snow under her worn leather boots was the last sound of the East she would ever willingly remember. It was a dead sound, a final, packing down sound, the sound of a grave being settled. Clara Davies held the collar of her thin woolen coat tight against a wind that bit with the teeth of a starving wolf, a wind that seemed to scour the very hope from the gray February sky. In her gloved hand, tucked inside a worn reticule, was a single letter. The paper was coarse, the handwriting a man's, strong, simple, and unadorned. It had traveled over 1,000 miles to find her. A stark, 4-sentence promise of a new life, a new name, and a new duty. Mrs. Davies, it read. Your letter has been received. The terms are agreeable. I will meet the stage in Redemption Creek, Texas, on the agreed-upon date. I trust your journey will be a safe one. Sincerely, Luke McGregor. That was all. No poetry, no pretense of affection. It was a contract, a deed of transfer for a life she no longer wanted. Tucked beside it was the small, crinkled advertisement she had answered from the pages of the Matrimonial Monitor. Her own letter of inquiry folded neatly behind it. Rancher, 34, widowed, no children, seeks a respectable woman for marriage, must be of good character, hard-working and willing to embrace the solitude of prairie life. A plain appearance is no obstacle. Honesty and diligence are the only dowry required. Honesty and diligence. Clara had those in spades. They were all she had left. Her first husband, Jacob, a gentle, scholarly man who smelled of paper and ink, had died of consumption 2 winters prior, leaving her with a mountain of quiet debts and the suffocating pity of his family. They had seen her as a duty, another mouth to feed, another soul to shepherd. And she, in turn, had seen marriage to Luke McGregor as her own duty, a way to unburden them, to secure a respectable place in the world where she was beholden to no one but a stranger, and to silence the whispers that followed a young widow in a small, pious town. Her trunk, containing all her worldly possessions, was a testament to her practicality. 2 sturdy dresses of brown and gray calico, a church dress of dark blue wool, undergarments, a sewing kit, her mother's Bible, and a single book of poetry, the only frivolity she allowed herself. As the train whistle shrieked, a final, mournful cry across the frozen landscape, she did not look back. To look back was to invite memory, and memory was a ghost that had haunted her for too long. Love, she had decided, was a sickness of the heart, a fever that promised warmth but left only ashes. Duty was the cure. Duty was a foundation of stone, solid and unchanging. It did not promise joy, but it offered shelter from the storm. The train journey was a jarring, clattering affair that slowly bled the snow-covered hills of Pennsylvania into the muddy fields of the Midwest. At St. Louis, she transferred to a stagecoach, a bone-rattling wooden box that smelled of stale sweat, cheap whiskey, and the dust of 1,000 desolate miles. Here, the world began to change. The greens and browns of the East gave way to an endless, bleached-out landscape, under a sky so vast and blue, it felt like a judgment. The other passengers were a blur of faces, a garrulous salesman hawking patent medicines, a stern-faced preacher with the eyes that seemed to look right through her, a weary family with 2 fretful children. Clara remained a quiet island in their midst, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the brutal, beautiful emptiness outside the window. They crossed into Texas, and the land became even more unforgiving. The rolling plains flattened into a hard-pan desert dotted with skeletal mesquite and prickly pear. The sun was a physical weight, a relentless hammer that beat down on the coach's canvas roof. The dust was a living thing. It coated her tongue, settled in the folds of her dress, and turned the air into a shimmering, gritty haze. She saw hills that looked as if they had been set ablaze, the grass burned to a crisp, black stubble against the red earth. It was a land that had been tried by fire and had survived, scarred and hardened. Clara felt a strange kinship with it. during the long, swaying days. She thought. She thought of Jacob, of the quiet, comfortable affection that had defined their marriage. It had been a safe harbor, not a grand passion. She had been a good wife. She had kept his home, honored his name, and mourned him with a sincerity that surprised even herself. But his death had unlocked a cage she hadn't known she was in. It had exposed her to the raw, untidy business of life, to the clucking tongues of the townswomen who questioned her every move, her period of mourning, her decision to answer a mail-order bride advertisement. Reputation, she knew, was a fragile thing, a piece of fine china that, once cracked, could never be truly mended. This marriage to a stranger was a desperate attempt to piece hers back together, to place it on a shelf so high no one could reach it. And she thought of love. The fear of it was a cold knot in her stomach. To love was to give a piece of yourself away, a piece that could be lost or broken. It was to be vulnerable, to expose the soft, secret parts of your soul to another. She had done that, once, before Jacob, and the memory was a scar she kept hidden beneath layers of duty and decorum. No, she would not love Luke McGregor. She would respect him. She would serve him. She would be a good and proper wife. That was the bargain. The advertisement had asked for honesty and diligence, not for her heart. And her heart, she vowed, would remain her own. Redemption Creek was less a town and more a wound in the earth. A single, wide, dusty street was flanked by a dozen or so wooden buildings, their false fronts peeling under the relentless sun. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, a livery stable, and a marshal's office. The air thrummed with the sounds of shouted conversations, the ring of a hammer on an anvil, and the tinny, melancholic notes of a piano drifting from the saloon's bat-wing doors. When the stagecoach groaned to a halt, raising a cloud of red dust, Clara felt 100 eyes on her. Men stopped their work, leaning on shovels or against porch posts, their gazes hungry and curious. A mail-order bride was an event, a curiosity to be inspected and judged. She smoothed her dress, adjusted her bonnet, and descended the steps, her back ramrod straight, her expression carefully neutral. She clutched her reticule as if it were an anchor in this sea of unfamiliar faces. She scanned the small crowd, searching for a man who fit the sparse description she had created in her mind. And then she saw him. He wasn't standing with the others. He was leaning against the wall of the general store, slightly apart from the crowd, as if he were not quite a part of it. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than she had imagined, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the unforgiving landscape around them. His hair was the color of dark earth, his jaw was square, and his eyes, a startlingly clear gray, were fixed on her. He wore simple, durable clothes, denim trousers worn pale at the knees, a flannel shirt, and a dusty, wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his features. He didn't smile or move, just watched her with an unnerving stillness. This had to be him. Clara took a steadying breath and walked toward him, the dust puffing up around the hem of her skirt. The short distance felt like a mile. When she stopped before him, she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his gaze. "Mr. McGregor?" she asked, her voice clearer and steadier than she felt. He pushed himself off the wall, his movements economical and sure. "Mrs. Davies," he replied. His voice was a low baritone, a gravelly sound like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. He removed his hat, a gesture of politeness that seemed almost out of place in this rough setting. "Welcome to Redemption Creek." His gaze was intense, not unkind, but analytical. It swept over her once, taking in her plain dress, her tidy hair, her resolute posture. His eyes, she noted, didn't linger on her face or her figure, as other men's might have. Instead, his attention seemed to snag on two specific things. First, her eyes. He seemed to search them for something, fear, perhaps, or desperation, and his brow furrowed slightly when he found only a placid, unreadable calm. Then, his gaze dropped for a fraction of a second to the base of her throat, where the high collar of her dress met her skin. She knew what he saw. A tiny, silvery line, no thicker than a thread. A faint scar that peeked just above the fabric when she turned her head a certain way. It was a ghost of a mark. A whisper from a past she had buried. His eyes flickered back to hers, a silent, unanswered question in their depths, before he seemed to dismiss it. "Your trunk?" he asked, his tone all business. "It is with the driver." He nodded, turning to retrieve it. He lifted the heavy trunk as if it were a child's toy, swinging it onto his shoulder with an easy strength that made her stomach flutter. There was a raw, physical power to him that was both intimidating and, to a part of her she refused to acknowledge, strangely compelling. "The ranch is a 3-day ride from here," he said, setting the trunk in the back of a sturdy buckboard wagon hitched to 2 strong-looking mules. "We'll make camp twice. You can buy any last provisions you might need at the general store." "I have all I require," she said. He looked at her small reticule, then at her. "It's a long way between stores out here." Nevertheless, she insisted quietly, "I am prepared." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave another short nod, accepting her answer without argument. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his hand briefly touching her elbow. His skin was rough, calloused, and warm through the fabric of her sleeve. The touch was impersonal, a simple courtesy, but it sent a jolt through her, a startling spark of awareness that she quickly suppressed. The journey from Redemption Creek was a descent into an even deeper solitude. The dusty track that passed for a road soon disappeared, and they were traveling across an ocean of grass that swayed and whispered in a wind that never seemed to stop. The sky was immense, a crushing weight of blue. There were no trees, no houses, no signs of human life for as far as the eye could see. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of the harness, and the relentless sighing voice of the wind. They rode mostly in silence. Luke was not a conversationalist. He seemed perfectly at home in the quiet, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the land with an expertise she could only guess at. He would occasionally point out a distant butte or a dry riverbed, naming them in his low rumble, "That's Sentinel Rock," or "The Cimarron runs there when there's rain." But they were statements of fact, not invitations to conversation. Clara, in turn, remained locked in her own quiet composure. She watched his hands on the reins, large, capable, and confident. She watched the muscles in his back shift as he guided the mules. He was a part of this land, as rugged and self-contained as the stony mesas in the distance. He was nothing like Jacob. The thought came unbidden, and she pushed it away. Comparisons were pointless. Jacob was the past. This man, this silent stranger, was her future, her duty. The first night, they made camp near a small, cottonwood-lined creek. He built a fire with brisk efficiency, its cheerful crackle a welcome defiance against the encroaching twilight. While he tended to the mules, Clara prepared a simple meal from the supplies he'd brought: bacon, beans, and hard biscuits. They ate sitting on opposite sides of the fire, the flames dancing between them. The silence, which had been companionable in the wagon, now felt thick and awkward. She felt the need to fill it, to define the terms of their new life, to erect the fences of propriety before any misunderstandings could take root. She cleared her throat, her spoon clinking against her tin plate. "Mr. McGregor," she began, her voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. "I wish to assure you that I understand the nature of our arrangement. I will strive to be a capable and diligent partner in your household." She paused, gathering her thoughts into a carefully rehearsed speech. "I am proficient in all manner of domestic tasks: cooking, cleaning, mending, preserving. I will keep your home in good order and conduct myself in a manner that brings no dishonor to your name. I understand my duties as a wife." She had meant the words to sound reassuring, to establish her value as a practical asset. But as they hung in the cool night air, they sounded cold and sterile, like the reading of a will. Luke had stopped eating. He stared at her from across the fire, his face half in shadow, his gray eyes unreadable but for a flicker of something she couldn't name. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was confusion, a deep, profound bewilderment, as if she were speaking a language he didn't understand. He said nothing for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the distant cry of a coyote. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "My name is Luke." That was all. He didn't address her speech, didn't acknowledge her declaration of duty. He simply offered his name, a small, simple bridge across the chasm she had just dug between them. He picked up his plate and finished his meal in silence. The rest of the journey passed in much the same way. On the third day, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, he pointed. "There!" In the distance, nestled in a slight depression in the endless prairie, was a small, dark shape. As they drew closer, it resolved into a house. It was a simple, sturdy-looking structure made of sod and rough-hewn timber, with a stone chimney and a small, covered porch. A larger barn stood a short distance away, along with a series of corrals. It was an island of human effort in an overwhelming sea of wilderness. It was plain, isolated, and stark. It was to be her home. The house was larger inside than it looked, consisting of one main room that served as a kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace at one end. 2 doors led off to smaller rooms. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. It was a man's home, Spartan, functional, and devoid of any softening touch. "The kitchen is there," Luke said, gesturing with his hat. "That room is mine. This one will be yours." He pushed open one of the doors, revealing a small bedroom containing a narrow bed with a simple quilt, a small wooden crate for a nightstand, and a single window that looked out onto the endless grass. "Thank you," Clara said softly. "It is more than adequate." He nodded, his expression unreadable as ever. "I'll see to the mules." He turned and left, leaving her alone in the sudden, ringing silence of the house. She placed her reticule on the bed and slowly unpinned her bonnet. This was it. This was her new life. A quiet house, a quiet man, and a litany of duties to fill the quiet days. It was what she had chosen. It was safe. Later, after a supper that was even quieter and more strained than the ones on the trail, they stood awkwardly in the main room, the flickering lantern light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The moment she had been dreading and preparing for had arrived. "I will retire now," she said, her voice a little tight. "Good night, Mr. McGregor." "Luke," he corrected her again, his voice gentle but firm. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face in the dim light. "Good night, Clara." It was the first time he had said her name. It sounded strange in his mouth, an unfamiliar sound in this unfamiliar place. She gave a curt nod and retreated into her room, closing the door firmly behind her. The click of the latch was a definitive sound, a boundary drawn. She undressed in the dark, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her dress. She slipped into her plain cotton nightgown and climbed into the narrow bed. The mattress was filled with straw, and it rustled beneath her. The air was cold, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain. And the wind, it was a constant presence, a living entity. It moaned around the corners of the house, rattled the window pane, and whistled down the stone chimney. It was the loneliest sound she had ever heard. She lay perfectly still, her hands clasped over her stomach, her body rigid. She had made it. She had crossed the country, delivered herself to her new husband, and secured her new life. She had performed her duty. So why did her heart feel like a cold, heavy stone in her chest? Sleep would not come. The moonlight, pale and white, streamed through a crack in the shutters, painting a silver line across the wooden floor. Every sound in the house was magnified: the groan of the timber, the pop and hiss of the dying embers in the fireplace. And then she heard it, a soft creak of the floorboards from the other room. His room. He was awake, too. In that moment, all her carefully constructed walls of duty and composure seemed to tremble. She was suddenly, acutely aware of him, of his presence just a few feet away. Separated only by a thin wooden wall, he was a stranger, yet he was her husband. This house, this life, this bed, they were all his. She held her breath, straining to hear more. Was that the sound of him turning in his bed? A quiet sigh? She found herself listening not just with her ears, but with her entire body, tuning into the silent rhythms of the house, trying to decipher the presence of the man in the next room. She tried to imagine him lying in the dark, his thoughts as unknown to her as the far side of the moon. And as she lay there, rigid in the cold, listening to the lonely wind and the secret sounds of the house, a startling realization came to her. In his room, on the other side of the wall, Luke McGregor was doing the exact same thing. He, too, was lying awake in the darkness, and he, too, was listening. The days settled into a rhythm, as stark and unvarying as the line of the horizon. Clara rose before the sun, the chill of the house a familiar companion. She moved with a quiet, relentless efficiency that was a kind of prayer to the god of duty. The fire was lit, the coffee boiled, and a breakfast of biscuits and salt pork was on the table by the time Luke came in from the barn, his face ruddy from the morning cold. He would eat in his customary silence, his gaze on his plate, and she would busy herself at the dry sink, her back to him. They were two planets in a fixed orbit, never touching, their gravity felt but never acknowledged. She learned the contours of her new life through labor, the house, under her care, transformed. She scrubbed the pine floors with lye soap until the wood was pale and fragrant. She washed the single window in her room until the vast, empty prairie outside seemed sharp enough to cut. She mended Luke's shirts with tiny, invisible stitches, erasing the signs of wear, making them whole again as if by magic. She discovered a small, fallow patch of earth behind the house, protected from the worst of the wind, and with Luke's tacit permission, began to turn the soil. She found a handful of forgotten seeds in the pantry, beans, squash, and hardy greens, and planted them with a fierce, focused hope. Tending the garden became her sanctuary. With her hands in the soil, the dry wind on her neck, she could almost forget the suffocating politeness of the house. Here, life was simple. You planted, you watered, you weeded, and if God was willing, things grew. Luke watched it all. He had expected a helpmeet, a functional presence to ease the burden of his solitude. He had not expected this whirlwind of quiet competence. The house had never been so clean, the food never so regular, and yet an unfamiliar unease settled in him. He had filled a void in his home, only to discover a different, more profound emptiness. Her efficiency was a wall. Her dutifulness was a fortress. She kept his home, but she gave nothing of herself. There was no shared laughter over a small mishap, no idle chatter at the end of the day, no comfortable silence born of companionship. There was only the vast, echoing quiet of two people abiding by the terms of a contract. The house was no longer lonely. It was haunted by the ghost of a connection that wasn't there. Sometimes, in the late afternoon when the sun slanted low and painted the prairie in hues of gold and rust, he would see her through the window. Her work for the day would be done, the kitchen tidy, the mending basket empty. She would take her single book and sit on the edge of the porch, in the sliver of shade offered by the roof, and as she read, he would see the transformation. The rigid set of her shoulders would soften. The tight, careful expression on her face would dissolve, replaced by something distant and unguarded. A stray wisp of her dark brown hair would escape its severe bun and curl against the nape of her neck. He would stand in the shadows of the barn, his hands still, a piece of leather or a harness strap forgotten in his grasp. He watched the way the light caught the pale, vulnerable skin of her throat, illuminating the faint, silvery trace of the scar he'd noticed that first day. In these moments, she was not Mrs. Davies, the mail-order bride. She was Clara, a woman with secrets held in the quiet depths of her eyes, a woman whose inner world was as vast and unknown to him as the prairie that surrounded them. A deep, unsettling curiosity began to stir in him. Who was she, this woman who spoke only of duty, but whose face, in the solitude of a story, held such a universe of feeling? He felt a strange, protective ache, a desire to know the source of the sadness that clung to her like a fine dust. The prairie summer arrived, hot and breathless. The creek that cut through a corner of Luke's land dwindled to a sluggish, shallow stream, but it was the only source of fresh water for the house. Hauling the heavy wooden buckets was one of Clara's most arduous tasks. One sweltering afternoon, she was making her way back up the slippery, shale-covered bank, a full bucket in each hand. The weight strained her arms and shoulders, and the sun beat down on her head, making her feel dizzy. Her boots slipped on a patch of wet stone. She cried out, a small, sharp sound of surprise, as she lost her balance. The buckets clattered to the ground, sloshing water over her skirt as she flailed, her arms pinwheeling as she tipped backward toward the shallow water. Suddenly, a hard, strong arm wrapped around her waist, yanking her back from the edge. It was Luke. He had been mending a fence line nearby and had seen her stumble. He pulled her flush against him, his body a solid wall of heat and strength. For a single, suspended moment, she was pressed against the hard planes of his chest. She could feel the steady, thumping beat of his heart against her back, smell the scent of sun, sweat, and dry grass that clung to him. His hand was splayed across her stomach, his grip firm and unyielding. The world seemed to stop, the buzz of insects and the sigh of the wind fading to nothing. There was only the shocking, electric reality of his touch. Panic, sharp and cold, shot through her. It was too close, too intimate. She wrenched herself away, stumbling forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'm all right," she managed to say, her voice thin and reedy. She wouldn't look at him. She stared at the spilled water darkening the thirsty ground. Luke took a step back, his own breathing suddenly uneven. "The stones are slick," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He bent down, picked up one of the empty buckets, and turned away to fill it at the creek. He didn't offer to help her with the other one, nor did he speak another word. He simply carried the full bucket back to the house, his stride long and purposeful, his back ramrod straight. Clara stood by the creek for a long time, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could still feel the imprint of his hand on her waist, the solid warmth of his chest against her back. It was a purely physical sensation, a memory of muscle and heat, but it had breached a wall deep inside her. She had built her life on control, on keeping a safe and proper distance. That single, reflexive moment of contact had shattered the illusion. He was not just Mr. McGregor, the rancher, the other party in her contract. He was a man, a living, breathing man whose touch could make her tremble. She finally picked up the other bucket, her hands shaking, and followed him back to the silent, waiting house. The air between them for the rest of the day was charged, thick with unspoken words and the ghost of a touch. A month after her arrival, their supplies ran low, and a trip to Redemption Creek was necessary. The 3-day journey was as silent as the first, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a palpable tension, a hyper-awareness of each other's presence on the narrow buckboard seat. Redemption Creek was as dusty and raw as she remembered, while Luke conducted his business with the blacksmith and the feed merchant. Clara went into the general store with a carefully prepared list. The store was the town's social hub, and a group of women were gathered near the fabric bolts, their heads close together, their voices a low buzz. As Clara entered, the buzzing stopped. All eyes turned to her. She recognized the storekeeper's wife, a portly woman named Mrs. Gable with small, inquisitive eyes. "Well, look what the wind blew in." "Mrs." Gable said, her voice carrying across the store. "It's the rancher's little snowbird. We were beginning to think you'd melted." A few of the women tittered. Clara felt a hot flush creep up her neck, but she kept her expression placid. She walked to the counter and handed her list to the storekeeper, a balding man who avoided her eyes. "Heard it's mighty quiet out at the McGregor place," one of the other women chimed in, loud enough for Clara to hear. "She doesn't look like much of a talker," another whispered, not quite softly enough. Mrs. Gable took a step closer, pretending to inspect a barrel of pickles. "Cold as the morning frost, I hear," she said in a conspiratorial stage whisper. "Poor Luke McGregor. Waited all this time for a wife, and he gets one who probably doesn't even know what a man is for, if you take my meaning." The cruelty of it, so casual and unthinking, was like a slap. It wasn't just about her. It was an insult to Luke, a public pitying of his choice. Clara's hands tightened on her reticule, her knuckles turning white. She thought of her carefully constructed reputation, her wall of duty. Here, in this place, it meant nothing. She was a curiosity, a piece of gossip. She lifted her chin, a faint, cool smile touching her lips, and turned to face the women. She would not let them see her crumble. But before she could speak, the door creaked open and Luke filled the frame. He took in the scene in an instant, the circle of gossiping women, their smug faces, and Clara, standing alone at the counter, pale but defiant, his gray eyes, usually so calm, turned to chips of flint. He walked past the women without a glance and stood beside Clara. He laid a heavy hand on the counter, the sound making the storekeeper jump. "Martha," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the silence. "You and your hens find something better to do than peck at my wife?" Mrs. Gable's face turned a mottled red. She stammered, "Now, Luke, we were just being friendly." "I know what you were being," he cut her off. "And I won't have it. Clara is my wife. Anyone who shows her disrespect shows it to me." He let the words hang in the air, a clear and undeniable threat. The women shuffled their feet and melted away, suddenly fascinated by sacks of flour and bolts of calico. Luke paid the stunned storekeeper for their goods, his movements sharp and angry. He carried the sacks out to the wagon, and Clara followed in his wake. They didn't speak of the incident on the long ride home. They didn't have to. He had defended her. He had called her my wife not as a statement of fact, but as a declaration of possession, of protection, and as they rode across the whispering plains, Clara felt a strange and unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. It was a dangerous feeling, one she had sworn off forever. It felt a little like gratitude, and a lot like something else she refused to name. The nights grew hotter, the air thick and still. Sleep became a fugitive. One night, Luke tossed and turned, tangled in his thin blanket, his mind a fever of restless thoughts. He thought of the scene in the store, of the defiant tilt of Clara's chin, of the vulnerability he had seen in her eyes before she had masked it with cold pride. He thought of her hands, so capable and gentle as they tended her small garden. He thought of the moment at the creek, the startling, momentary weight of her in his arms, the softness of her body against his. He drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep, and he dreamed. In the dream, he was in his room, but it was different. The air was soft, and the moonlight streaming through the window was as thick and white as milk. The door to her room creaked open. She stood there, a silhouette against the lesser dark of the main room. Her hair was down, a dark cascade over the shoulders of her white nightgown. She didn't speak. She simply walked toward his bed, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She stopped beside him, and in the moonlight, he could see her face. The careful, guarded mask was gone. In her eyes was a deep and profound longing. a mirror of the ache in his own soul. She reached out a hand, not to touch him, but to hover just above his chest, as if she could feel the heat of him, the frantic beating of his heart. He woke with a gasp, his own heart hammering against his ribs. The room was empty. The moonlight was just moonlight, thin and cold. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the creak of the house settling in the heat. He sat up, running a hand over his face. It had been so real, so vivid. The longing, the silence, the unspoken question in her eyes. He felt a wave of frustration and a raw, aching loneliness that was sharper than anything he had felt before she arrived. He got up and went to the window, staring out at the pale, sleeping prairie. The dream had been a lie, a trick of a lonely mind, but the feeling it had left behind was the truest thing he had felt in years. A week later, the storm came. It had been brewing for days, the heat building to an oppressive, suffocating weight. The sky turned a bruised, greenish yellow, and the air grew unnervingly still. Luke had spent the afternoon securing the barn and reinforcing the corral gates. Clara had brought in the last of her vegetables from the garden and barred the shutters on the windows. The wind hit just after dusk, a low moan that quickly rose to a furious, shrieking howl. It was a physical assault, a solid wall of sound and fury that made the little house groan and tremble. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid, horizontal sheets that hammered against the roof and walls. It sounded as if the sky were being torn apart. They sat in the main room, the single lantern casting a small, flickering pool of light in the overwhelming darkness. The roar of the storm was so loud they couldn't have spoken if they had wanted to. Luke stood by the main door, his body tense, listening to the tortured sounds of the house. Clara sat at the table, her hands clenched in her lap, her face a pale oval in the gloom. There was a sudden, sharp crack, followed by the sound of shattering glass. The wind howled through the house, extinguishing the lantern and plunging them into absolute blackness. "The window in your room!" Luke yelled over the din. A moment later, they heard a new sound, a steady, rhythmic dripping. Clara felt her way through the darkness toward her room. The floor just inside the door was already slick with water. The shutter had been torn from its hinges, and the rain was pouring in, soaking her bed, her trunk, everything. "It's flooding," she called out, her voice tight with alarm. Luke appeared beside her, a black shape in the blackness. He swore, a low, harsh sound. "You can't stay in here. Get what you need. You'll have to come into my room." There was no time to argue, no room for propriety. The storm had stripped all of that away. She felt for her reticule on the soaked bed, grabbed a dry blanket from the top of her trunk, and followed him out of the ruined room. His room was at the back of the house and, for the moment, was dry and secure. He managed to relight the lantern, its flame sputtering and dancing wildly. The room was as Spartan as the rest of the house, a solid bed, a wooden chest, and a rifle rack on the wall. The roar of the wind and rain was slightly muffled here, but it was still a terrifying, elemental sound. "You take the bed," he said, his voice clipped and impersonal. He didn't look at her. He was already spreading a spare blanket on the floor near the door. "No, I can't," she protested. "It's your bed. I'll take the floor." "Don't argue with me, Clara," he said, and for the first time, his voice held a raw, sharp edge of command. "Get in the bed, now!" Humbled and shaken, she did as he said, climbing onto the bed and pulling her own dry blanket around her shoulders. She huddled against the wall, making herself as small as possible. The mattress smelled faintly of him, of soap and wood smoke. Luke lay down on the floor, his back to her, a silent, unmoving shape. The storm raged on. For what felt like hours, they remained that way. Two strangers trapped in a small, flickering bubble of light, surrounded by a world of chaos. The silence inside the room was more profound, more intimate than any words could ever be. Every creak of the bed as she shifted, every rustle of his blanket as he turned, was a sound that seemed to scream in the quiet. She could hear him breathing, a slow, steady rhythm in the heart of the storm, and she knew, with a certainty that made her own breath catch in her throat, that he could hear hers, too. The wind howled, the house shook, and the distance between them, once 1,000 miles of carefully constructed duty, had shrunk to a few feet of thin, charged air. The dawn that broke after the storm was unnervingly beautiful. The world outside was scrubbed clean, glistening and raw, the air tasting of rain and freshly turned earth. The sky, a tender, bruised purple at the horizon, was swept clear of clouds. But the beauty was deceptive. A section of the corral fence was down. The creek had overflowed its banks, and Clara's small garden was a ruin of mud and broken stems. The peace was the peace of exhaustion, not of tranquility. Inside the small house, the silence was heavier than the storm's fury had been. In the pale morning light, Luke's room seemed impossibly small, the air thick with the memory of their shared confinement. Clara slid from the bed before he was fully awake, her movements stiff and measured. He rose from the floor, and for a moment they stood on opposite sides of the room, avoiding each other's eyes. Two strangers who had weathered a siege together and now had no idea what to say. The carefully drawn lines of their arrangement had been washed away in the deluge, and they were left standing on unfamiliar, treacherous ground.
"The window,"
Clara began, her voice raspy. "I'll fix it today," Luke said, already pulling on his boots. His voice was flat, revealing nothing. They fell back into their roles as if grabbing for a lifeline. He went outside to face the wreckage of his ranch. She went into the main room to face the mess of her own. She swept up the broken glass from her bedroom window and mopped the muddy water, her motions precise and mechanical. Duty was a familiar rhythm, a comforting cadence in the chaotic aftermath. But something had irrevocably shifted. Every time she heard his footsteps outside, her head would lift, her senses on high alert. Every time he passed the open doorway, his presence seemed to fill the entire house. The space between them had collapsed in the night, and now, even with walls restored, the memory of that proximity lingered like a phantom limb. Her room was uninhabitable for the time being, the mattress soaked through, so her things were moved into the main room, a silent acknowledgement that the boundaries of the house had been redrawn. A few days later, the relentless sun had baked the mud into a hard crust. Luke was working to repair the damaged section of the barn roof, the storm having torn away a wide swath of shingles. The heat was a physical presence, a shimmering blanket that smothered the prairie. Clara, her apron already damp with perspiration, brought a dipper of cool water from the well, her steps slowing as she approached the barn. He was stripped to the waist, his back to her. He was reaching up to hammer a new board into place, and the movement sent the muscles across his back and shoulders into a symphony of fluid. Powerful motion. His skin, tanned a deep bronze by the sun, shone with a light sheen of sweat. He was lean but immensely strong, built not of bulk but of dense, functional muscle carved from years of hard labor. He was like the land itself, rugged, resilient, and utterly without artifice. Clara stopped dead in her tracks, the tin dipper suddenly heavy in her hand. She had seen men without their shirts before, of course, farm hands and laborers in her old life, but it had been an impersonal sight, a simple fact of work and weather. This was different. This was Luke. This was the man whose breathing she had listened to in the dark, the man whose heart had beat a steady rhythm just feet from her own. A slow, hot blush crept up her neck and spread across her cheeks, a wave of heat that had nothing to do with the sun. It was a shocking, involuntary betrayal by her own body. She felt a strange, dizzying flutter in the pit of her stomach, a feeling so alien she couldn't put a name to it. Her fingers tightened, crumpling the rough fabric of her apron as if it were a shield. He shifted, turning to reach for another nail, and she fled, her heart hammering, leaving the dipper of water on a nearby fence post. She hurried back to the safety of the house, her cheeks burning, shaken by the raw, unexpected power of the sight. A week passed. The rhythm of their lives continued, but now it was underscored by a new, unspoken awareness. The glances they exchanged held a different weight. The silences were filled with questions neither dared to ask. One afternoon, seeking a respite from the oppressive heat inside the house, Clara took a bucket of water and a bar of lye soap to the privacy of the well behind the barn to wash her hair. She thought she was alone. The ranch was silent save for the buzz of insects and the cry of a distant hawk. She unpinned the heavy coil of her hair, letting it fall in a thick, dark curtain down her back. She unbuttoned the top of her dress for comfort, letting the fabric fall away from her shoulders. Luke was walking back from the far pasture, having spent the day mending the fence line she and he had been working on. He moved with a quiet, ground-eating stride, his thoughts on the coming winter and the price of cattle. As he rounded the corner of the barn, he saw her. He stopped instantly, concealed by the deep shadow of the structure. She was leaning over the stone well, pouring a dipper of water over her head. Her hair, black and glistening, clung to her skin. Her dress had slipped, exposing the pale, vulnerable expanse of her back and shoulders to the dappled sunlight. And there, stark against the creamy skin just below her left shoulder blade, he saw it. It was a scar, not a thin, silvery line like the one on her neck, but a brutal mark. It was a puckered, ugly trail of raised tissue, several inches long, the color of old parchment. It was the kind of scar left not by accident, but by intention. It spoke of a past violence so profound it had left its signature etched into her very flesh. He stood frozen, a cold knot tightening in his gut. This was the source of her fear. This was the reason for the walls she built around herself, for the carefully controlled calm in her eyes. The woman who spoke only of duty, who flinched from an accidental touch, who lived her life as if bracing for a blow. She had been hurt, badly. The sight of it filled him with a sudden, savage anger at the unknown person who had put that mark on her. It was followed by a wave of something else, a deep, aching tenderness that was almost painful. He wanted to go to her, to cover the scar with his hand, to somehow erase the pain that had caused it. But he didn't. He knew that to reveal himself now would be to shame her, to tear down a wall she wasn't ready to relinquish. It would be a violation of the fragile trust that was beginning, ever so slowly, to grow between them. So he backed away, as silent as a shadow, his heart heavy with the secret he now carried. He didn't ask her about it. He wouldn't, but from that day on, when he looked at her, he saw not just the capable, reserved woman who was his wife, but the survivor who bore the map of her pain on her skin. In late summer, a notice was posted in Redemption Creek announcing a town social and barn dance to celebrate the harvest. It was the biggest event of the year, a time for the scattered, isolated ranchers and homesteaders to come together. "We should go," Luke said one evening, his voice carefully neutral. Clara looked up from her mending. "A dance? I don't think. I'm not one for such things." The thought of the crowds, of the noise, of Mrs. Gable and her circle of gossips made her stomach clench. "It's expected," he said gently. "People will talk if the new Mrs. McGregor doesn't show her face. It would be a slight—" She knew he was right. Duty, once again.
Very well,
she said, her voice barely a whisper. On the night of the dance, she put on her one good dress, the one of dark blue wool that she had worn for church back east. It felt heavy and suffocating in the Texas heat. She pinned her hair with extra care, her hands trembling slightly. When she emerged from the main room, Luke was waiting. He had slicked his hair back with water and was wearing a clean flannel shirt. He stopped when he saw her, his gaze sweeping over her. He didn't say she looked beautiful. He wasn't a man for such words, but a look of quiet approval flickered in his gray eyes. A look that made her skin tingle. The barn was lit with dozens of lanterns, the air thick with the scent of hay, sawdust, and cheap perfume. A trio of fiddlers sawed away at a lively tune, their music barely audible over the boisterous laughter and stomping feet of the dancers. For Clara, it was an overwhelming assault on the senses after the profound quiet of the prairie. She felt exposed, out of place, a drab sparrow in a flock of peacocks. Luke led her to a bench along the wall. "Can I get you some punch?" he asked. She nodded, grateful for a moment alone. As he walked away, a woman intercepted him. She was a handsome woman, with a cascade of blonde hair and a bright, confident smile. She laid a familiar hand on Luke's arm, and he stopped, a slow smile spreading across his own face as they spoke. Clara watched, her hands twisting in her lap. When Luke returned with 2 cups of punch, the woman was still with him. "Clara," he said, "this is Amelia Vance. We grew up on neighboring ranches. Amelia, this is my wife, Clara." Amelia's smile was brilliant, but her eyes were sharp and assessing as they scanned Clara from head to toe. "A pleasure to finally meet you," she said, her voice sweet as honey. "We were all so surprised to hear Luke had finally settled down. We almost thought he was a lost cause." She laughed, a light, musical sound, and squeezed Luke's arm again. The fiddlers struck up a new song, a waltz. "Oh, this is my favorite," Amelia exclaimed. She looked up at Luke, her eyes sparkling. "For old time's sake, Luke?" He hesitated, glancing at Clara. "Go on," Clara said, her voice perfectly even. "I do not dance." It was a lie. She knew how to dance. But the thought of being in his arms, in this public space, was more than she could bear. He gave her a searching look, then allowed Amelia to pull him onto the dance floor. Clara watched them from the shadows. They moved together with an easy, practiced grace. Amelia fit perfectly in his arms. She would look up at him and laugh, and he would smile back, his usual reserve melting away. They looked right. They looked like they belonged together. A sharp, ugly feeling twisted in Clara's gut. It was a hot, coiling serpent of a feeling that she had never experienced before. It was raw and possessive, and it stole her breath. She watched Amelia's hand resting on Luke's shoulder, the same shoulder she had seen bare and powerful in the sun, and she felt a primitive urge to walk onto that floor and tear it away. The realization of what she was feeling hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was jealousy. It was a messy, chaotic, deeply personal emotion, and it had no place in her ordered world of duty and control. It was terrifying. The dance ended, but Amelia did not relinquish her claim on Luke, drawing him into a circle of her friends. Clara remained on her bench, a solitary figure in the shifting crowd, the cup of punch untouched in her hands. She felt a profound and aching loneliness, a loneliness deeper than any she had known on the empty prairie. The ride home was under a canopy of brilliant, indifferent stars. The silence in the buckboard was cold and vast. The warmth and camaraderie of the dance had only served to highlight the chasm between them. Finally, as they neared the dark silhouette of the ranch house, Luke spoke, his voice low and strained in the darkness. "The Vances sold their spread and moved off a few years back. I hadn't seen Amelia since before my first wife passed." He was offering an explanation, an excuse. Clara said nothing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He let out a frustrated sigh. "Clara," he said, his voice softer now, "were you jealous?" The question was so direct, so perilously close to the truth she was desperately trying to deny, that her defenses slammed shut. She turned to him, her face a pale mask in the starlight. "I am a wife by mail, Mr. McGregor," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. The use of his formal name was a deliberate cruelty, a way to push him back to the safety of their original contract. "Our arrangement is one of convenience and necessity. Jealousy is an emotion. It is a luxury. It is not among my duties." She saw his hands tighten on the reins, He flinched as if she had struck him. The quiet hope that had been growing between them, the fragile bridge built of shared storms and silent observations, crumbled into dust. He said nothing more. The rest of the ride passed in a silence that was heavier and more painful than any they had ever shared. That night, sleep was an impossibility. Clara lay in her temporary bed in the main room, her body rigid, her mind in turmoil. Her own words echoed in her ears. "Jealousy is not among my duties." She had thrown his question back in his face, denied the truth that was screaming inside her, and in doing so, had hurt him. She knew it. She had seen it in the taut line of his jaw. Why had she done it? Because the feeling was a threat. To acknowledge it would be to acknowledge that he was more to her than a rancher, that this arrangement was more than a contract. It would be to acknowledge the terrifying possibility of a heart that she had sworn to keep locked away. The house was still. The only sound was the ticking of her own frantic heart. She couldn't bear it. She couldn't bear the cold silence she had created, on an impulse that came from a place deeper than thought. She rose from her bed. Her bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor. She crossed the main room and stopped before the closed door to his bedroom. Her hand trembled as she reached for the latch. She pushed the door open a crack. A sliver of moonlight cut across the room, illuminating his form in the bed. He was lying on his back, one arm thrown over his head. He wasn't asleep. She could feel the tension in him, the stillness of a man who was wide awake and wrestling with his own demons. He didn't move as she crept into the room. He simply watched her, his eyes dark pools of shadow in the pale light. What was she doing? She didn't know. The words wouldn't come. She reached his bedside, her heart a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. She was terrified, but the need that had driven her from her bed was stronger than her fear. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out her hand. She didn't touch his face or his arm. She laid her palm flat against the center of his chest, over his heart. The thin cotton of his nightshirt was warm beneath her hand, and under her palm, she felt it, the steady, strong, rhythmic beat of his heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of his life. It was solid and real and true. It was the answer to a question she hadn't even known how to ask. It was an anchor in the storm of her confusion. She felt his own hand come up to cover hers, his rough, calloused fingers gently enveloping her own. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The simple, profound pressure of his hand was enough. For a long, breathless moment, they stayed that way, connected by that single point of contact in the moonlit silence. Then, as quietly as she had come, she withdrew her hand from under his and backed away. She turned and slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her, leaving him alone in the darkness with the lingering warmth of her touch and the undeniable, thundering beat of his own heart. The aftermath of her moonlit visit to his room was a profound and unsettling stillness. The act, so simple yet so charged, had broken a seal. The cold, formal distance they had maintained was gone, replaced by a fragile, terrifying intimacy. They moved about the house with a heightened awareness, their paths crossing with a new, shy hesitation. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the memory of her hand on his chest and the steady, answering beat of his heart. It was a silence not of absence, but of overwhelming presence. This delicate, unacknowledged truce was shattered a week later by the sight of a rider on the horizon. It was a rare event, an intrusion from the outside world that always set Luke on edge. This rider, however, was different. He wasn't a drifting cowboy or a lost traveler. He rode a fine-boned eastern horse, and as he drew closer, they could see he was dressed in a dark traveling suit and a derby hat, both coated in a fine layer of prairie dust, but still conspicuously out of place. He looked like a crow that had lost its way and ended up in a field of eagles. Luke stood on the porch, his body a study in stillness, his hand resting casually on a post near the axe he'd been using. Clara, who had come out to see what had captured his attention, felt a prickle of unease. The man reined in his horse a few yards from the house, his gaze sweeping over the simple sod structure with a faint, dismissive curl of his lip. Then his eyes found Clara, and a slow, proprietary smile spread across his face. "Clara, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, a sound as alien in this landscape as his clothing. "I have come a very long way to find you." The world tilted on its axis. The blood drained from Clara's face, and the air in her lungs turned to ice. She knew that voice. She knew that smile. It was the stuff of her nightmares, the ghost she had crossed a continent to escape. It was Mr. Alistair Finch.
"What are you doing here?"
she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. Finch dismounted with a practiced grace, pulling a letter from his inside pocket. "Your mother was beside herself with worry. Of course, when my inquiries finally led me here, well, she insisted I deliver this to you personally. She is most anxious for your return." He held out the letter, but his eyes never left her face. They were cold, assessing eyes, the eyes of a merchant inspecting merchandise. Luke moved, stepping down from the porch to stand between Clara and the newcomer. He was a full head taller than Finch, and his sheer physical presence made the other man look small and insignificant.
"She's not returning anywhere,"
Luke said, his voice a low rumble. "She's my wife." Finch's smile tightened. "Ah, yes, the arrangement, a quaint, if rather desperate, solution to your little problem. Clara, but hardly a binding one. Under the circumstances, your family requires your presence. The only thing she requires is for you to get back on your horse and ride out." Luke said. He hadn't raised his voice, but the quiet menace in it was unmistakable. He looked at Clara, at her ashen face and the terror in her eyes, and a cold, protective fury began to build in his chest. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew he was the source of the shadows that haunted her. A bitter, unfamiliar taste rose in his throat. It was jealousy, raw and savage. But it was more than that. It was the feeling of a predator threatening his home. "I'm staying at the hotel in Redemption Creek," Finch said, ignoring Luke and speaking only to Clara. "We will talk tomorrow. There are matters to discuss." He gave a small, mocking bow, climbed back on his horse, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. Clara stood frozen, the unread letter from her mother a damning piece of evidence in her hand. Her past had found her. The sanctuary she had so carefully constructed had been breached. "Clara," Luke said, his voice soft but firm, pulling her from her trance.
"Who is he?"
She couldn't answer. She just shook her head, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek, before she turned and fled into the house. The next morning, Luke was grim. "I'm taking supplies into town," he announced. It was a statement, not a question. "You're coming with me." He would not leave her alone with the ghost of her past hovering so close. The journey to Redemption Creek was a torment of silence. Clara sat beside him, rigid with fear. Alistair Finch was the man her family had chosen for her after Jacob's death. He was a wealthy investor, a man of standing, and he had seen the widowed, indebted Clara as a suitable, pliable addition to his household. He had spoken not of love, but of contracts and expectations. His touch was cold, his eyes possessive. He had cornered her, using her family's financial ruin as leverage, weaving a cage of obligation around her. Her escape, the desperate answer to a mail-order bride advertisement, had been a flight to freedom, and now the cage had followed her. They found Finch taking a late breakfast in the town's only eatery. He rose when he saw them, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "Ah, Clara, I was just about to ride out to see you," he said smoothly, pointedly ignoring Luke. "Come, let us speak privately." He reached for her arm. Luke's hand shot out, clamping down on Finch's wrist like a man-trap. "She's not going anywhere with you." Finch's face flushed with anger. He tried to wrench his arm away, but Luke's grip was like iron. "Unhand me, you brutish farmer," he hissed. "This is a family matter." "She has a family," Luke said, his voice dangerously low. "And you're not it." The scene had drawn the attention of the entire room. Men stopped their conversations. The serving girl froze, a coffee pot in her hand. Finch, realizing he was making a spectacle of himself, changed tactics. "You have no idea who you have married," he sneered at Luke. "You think you have some pristine flower of the East? Ask her what she was running from. Ask her what kind of trouble she was in." Clara felt the color drain from her face. She felt the eyes of the townspeople on her, the same prying, judgmental eyes from the general store. Luke released Finch's wrist with a shove. "Get out!" "Not without her," Finch shot back, his confidence returning. "She has obligations." "Her only obligation is to me." Luke took a step forward, shielding Clara with his body. "Now I'm telling you for the last time. Leave." Finch, emboldened by the audience, decided to make his stand. He threw a clumsy, telegraphed punch aimed at Luke's face. Luke, who had been in his share of rough-and-tumble fights, moved his head an inch to the side, the punch whistling past his ear. He didn't retaliate with a flurry of blows. He hit Finch once. It was a single, hard, straight punch to the jaw, delivered with the full force of his body. The sound of the impact was a sickening crack that echoed in the silent room. Finch staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing in a heap on the dusty floorboards. He scrambled back to his feet, holding a hand to his jaw, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. The fight was over before it had begun. He glared at Luke. Then his venomous gaze shifted to Clara. "You think he'll still want you when he knows the truth?" he spat, his voice thick with pain. He backed toward the door, a final, poisonous arrow in his quiver. "She's not as clean as you think, rancher. She's damaged goods." He turned and fled, leaving his words hanging in the air like a foul stench. Damaged goods. The phrase echoed in the silent room. In Clara's head, a final branding iron on her soul. Luke threw a few coins on the counter to pay for the damage and, taking Clara's arm, led her out into the harsh, unforgiving sunlight. The ride back to the ranch was the longest 3 days of her life. The silence was no longer fragile or questioning. It was a dead weight, an accusation. Luke's face was a granite mask, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He hadn't looked at her once since they'd left town. She was certain it was over. The doubt Finch had planted would grow, and he would send her away. The shame was a physical thing, a sickness in her stomach. When they finally arrived back at the house, she knew she had to speak. She couldn't let it end with Finch's ugly words being the final truth between them. As Luke unhitched the mules, she stood in the center of the main room, her hands clenched at her sides, and waited. He came in, closing the door behind him, and the sound seemed to seal them in. He still wouldn't look at her. He walked to the fireplace, leaning an arm against the stone mantel, his back to her. "The things he said," she began, her voice trembling. "They are not true. Not in the way he meant." He remained silent, his back a rigid wall. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and the words began to pour out, halting and painful. She told him everything, about her family's desperation after Jacob's death, about Alistair Finch and his cold, calculating proposal. She told him of the pressure, the feeling of being trapped, of being sold. He did not harm me in the way you might think," she stammered, the words tasting like ash. "The scars, I was running away. The night I left to mail my letter to the matrimonial agency, I was in a hurry. I slipped from a carriage in the dark. It was my own foolishness, my own desperation that caused them. But he was the reason I was running. He made me feel unclean, like property. That is the truth I was hiding. I was so ashamed. I wanted to be someone new, someone respectable, someone who was only what she appeared to be." She finished, her confession hanging in the silent room. She was empty, exposed, with no secrets left to hide behind. She waited for his judgment. Luke stood with his back to her for a very long time. The silence stretched, each second a new turn of the screw in her heart. He was piecing it all together, her reserve, her fear of touch, the scars, the fierce attachment to duty. It was all a shield, a desperate attempt to hide the broken places inside her. When he finally turned, his face was etched with an emotion she couldn't read. His gray eyes were dark with thought. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw not disgust, not pity, but a deep, profound sadness. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and stopped in front of her. He gently cupped her face in his rough, calloused hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. He was quiet for another moment, and then he spoke, his voice low and raspy with an emotion that cracked its surface. "I don't need a perfect woman, Clara," he said. "I don't need someone respectable, or someone who's only what she appears to be." He swallowed, his gaze boring into hers, willing her to believe him. "I need you." The simple words broke her. The dam of control she had maintained for years, the wall of duty, the fortress of composure. It all shattered into a million pieces. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ragged sound of pain and relief. She collapsed against him, and his arms came around her, holding her tight, holding her together as the storm of tears she had held back for so long finally broke. He held her while she cried, his hand stroking her hair, his chin resting on the top of her head. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy comforts. He just held her, a solid, unmoving anchor in her storm. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, he tilted her face up to his. The space between them was electric. The last of the walls were gone, washed away by her confession and his acceptance. What was left was something raw and real and undeniable. He looked at her tear-stained face, at the vulnerability in her eyes, and he saw not the damaged woman Finch had described, but the strong, beautiful survivor who had captivated him from the very beginning. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of profound, desperate need, a confirmation of everything his words had just promised. It was a claiming. She responded with a fervor that surprised them both, her arms winding around his neck, her body pressing against his. It was the kiss of a woman starved, a woman who had denied herself the very idea of passion and was now drowning in it. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her into his bedroom. There were no more words. There was no more need for them. This was no longer about duty or obligation, about a contract signed between strangers. This was about 2 lonely, wounded people who had found each other in the vast emptiness of the prairie. He laid her gently on the bed. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, bathing the room in a warm, golden light. With trembling fingers, he began to unbutton her dress. When the worn calico fell away, he didn't look at her scars with pity. He traced the ugly, puckered line on her back with a gentle finger, and then he leaned down and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to it, an act of healing, of acceptance, that made her gasp. Then it was his turn to be vulnerable as his own shirt fell to the floor. The feel of his bare chest against hers was a shock, a jolt of skin against skin that was so intimate, so real. It stole her breath. Their breathing was ragged, their hearts hammering in a frantic, shared rhythm. Outside, the prairie wind began to pick up, its mournful sighing building into a roar that seemed to echo the tempest of release and discovery inside the small room. It was a wild, desperate coming together, a shedding of old skins and old pains, a fiery, beautiful consummation not of a marriage contract, but of 2 souls finally finding their way home. Much later, as the first pale light of dawn crept into the room, Clara stirred. She was wrapped in Luke's arms, her head on his chest, the steady beat of his heart a comforting rhythm beneath her ear. the scent of him, of his skin, was all around her. For the first time in years, she felt utterly, completely safe. She felt cherished. She lay there, listening to his quiet breathing, and a profound sense of peace settled over her. But as the light grew stronger, a small, cold tendril of her old fear began to uncoil in the pit of her stomach. The night had been a fever dream of passion and acceptance, but morning was a time for harsh reality. Finch's ugly words echoed in her mind. Damaged goods. Luke had accepted her past, had kissed her scars, had taken her in a way that left no doubt of his desire. But desire was a fleeting thing. Love was for whole, unbroken people. She looked at the strong, sleeping man beside her, at the peaceful expression on his face, and a terrible, aching question lodged itself in her heart. A woman like her, a woman with a past that was literally carved into her skin, was she truly worthy of being loved? The world, which had seemed to crack open and bloom with fragile color in the aftermath of their union, began to die. The sun, which had warmed them, turned into a malevolent, brassy eye in a bleached white sky. The rain that had blessed them on the night of the storm did not return. Day after day, the sun beat down, baking the earth into a network of deep, thirsty cracks. The vibrant sea of prairie grass turned a sickly yellow, then a brittle, lifeless brown. The creek shrank, pulling back from its banks, until it was nothing more than a muddy trickle in a bed of dry, sun-scorched stones. A relentless, hot wind blew day and night, picking up the topsoil and sending it swirling in great, choking clouds of red dust that coated everything, gritting in their teeth, hazing the horizon and turning the sunsets into a bloody, apocalyptic spectacle. The drought was a slow, creeping siege. It was a third presence in their small house, a silent, relentless enemy. The joy they had found in each other was now tempered by a constant, gnawing anxiety. They worked from sunup to sundown, their bodies aching, their faces etched with worry. Luke's small herd of cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like the hoops on a barrel. He spent his days riding farther and farther in search of grazing, his face growing leaner, the lines around his eyes deepening. Clara's garden, her small sanctuary of hope, withered and died despite her desperate efforts, the soil turning to powder in her hands. They had to sell off half the herd for a fraction of their worth, just to have enough money to buy feed for the rest. Then came the notice from the land office. The property taxes were due. The small roll of bills Luke kept in a tin box in his room was nowhere near enough. The debt hung over them, a constant, unspoken weight. But the hardship forged a new kind of intimacy between them. Their passion, born in a storm of confession and release, now settled into something deeper, quieter, and more resilient. They were partners, a unit of two against an unforgiving world. In the evenings, they would sit at the table, too tired to speak, and he would reach across and take her hand, his calloused thumb stroking her knuckles. It was a simple gesture, but it said everything. We are in this together. She would mend his torn shirts, her stitches small and fierce, a tangible act of care against the forces that were trying to tear their world apart. She saw the unwavering strength in him, a core of iron that would not bend, and he saw in her a quiet resilience that matched his own. She was not a fragile eastern flower. She was a prairie rose, slender but with roots that ran deep and a spirit that would not be broken by the wind. She refused to leave his side, refused to show a moment of despair in his presence. Her strength became his, and his, hers. But their private battle was not the only one they had to fight. Alistair Finch had been vanquished. But the poison he had spat into the air in Redemption Creek had found fertile ground in the bored, self-righteous minds of the townspeople. His words, damaged goods, had taken root and blossomed into a garden of ugly, thorny gossip. On a necessary trip into town for flour and salt, the hostility was a palpable thing. When Clara walked into the general store, conversations would cease. The women, Mrs. Gable and her circle, would turn their backs, their shoulders a wall of stiff condemnation. Men who had once tipped their hats to Luke would now give him a curt nod, their eyes sliding away from Clara as if her presence were an indecency. They were pariahs. The story, twisted and embellished with each telling, was that Luke McGregor, in his loneliness, had been duped. He had sent for a respectable wife and had instead received a sullied woman of questionable character, a cast-off from the East who had run from some unnamed, but surely scandalous, trouble. The final, brutal confirmation of their ostracism came on a blistering hot market day. Clara had gone to the community well in the center of the town square to draw water for the journey home, while Luke loaded their meager supplies into the wagon. As she worked the handle of the pump, a group of women approached, Mrs. Gable at their head. They formed a silent, menacing circle around her. "Some people have no shame," Mrs. Gable said, her voice loud enough for everyone in the square to hear. "Coming here, pretending to be a decent wife, when we all know what you are." Clara kept her eyes on the bucket, her knuckles white on the pump handle. "I have no quarrel with you, Mrs. Gable. Your very presence is a quarrel with all decent folk." Another woman chimed in. "Bringing your filth to our town." Clara finished filling her bucket and stood up, intending to walk away, to deny them the satisfaction of a response. But as she turned, Mrs. Gable took a dipper of water from her own bucket and, with a look of theatrical disgust, flung it at her. The tepid, dirty water splashed across the front of Clara's dress, soaking the bodice and running in grimy rivulets down her skirt. A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by a few titters of cruel laughter. It wasn't a physical assault, but it was a profound and public humiliation. It was a baptism of shame, a declaration that she was unclean, unworthy. For a moment, Clara was frozen, the shock of it stealing her breath. She could feel 100 eyes on her, feasting on her degradation. The old, familiar feeling washed over her, the feeling of being trapped, judged, and found wanting. She was damaged goods, and now everyone knew it. Then she heard a roar. It was a sound of pure, primal fury, and it cut through the noise of the market like a bolt of lightning. Luke had seen the whole thing. He vaulted from the wagon and crossed the square in a few long, terrifying strides. His face was a thundercloud, his gray eyes blazing with a light that made men twice his size take a step back. The women who had been so bold a moment before shrank away, their faces pale. He stopped in front of Mrs. Gable, who looked as if she might faint. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. He simply leaned in close, his voice a low, shaking snarl of rage. "You will never," he breathed, "lay a hand on my wife again. Do you understand me?" Mrs. Gable could only manage a terrified, squeaking nod. Luke didn't spare another glance for the crowd. He turned to Clara, his face softening with a fierce, protective tenderness. He took the heavy bucket from her trembling hand. "Let's go home," he said softly. He put his arm around her shoulders, ignoring the dark, wet stain on her dress, and led her through the silent, parting crowd to the wagon. He helped her up, his touch gentle, and as they rode out of town, he kept his arm around her, a solid, defiant shield against the world. That night, the weight of the day's events settled over the small house. Luke was a coiled spring of unvented rage, pacing the main room like a caged wolf. But Clara was still and quiet, a profound and terrible resolution forming in her heart. She was the source of his trouble. She was the reason the town had turned against him, the reason his name was being dragged through the mud. The drought was an act of God. But this was her fault. Her past, her shame, had become a millstone around his neck. She waited until he had stopped pacing and was staring into the cold fireplace. "Luke," she said, her voice unnaturally calm, "I am going to leave." He turned slowly, his face incredulous. "What did you say?" "I will pack my things in the morning," she continued, her gaze fixed on her hands, which were clenched in her lap.
I will go somewhere new, where no one knows me. This is my burden, not yours.
You deserve a good life, a place of respect in the community. I am taking that from you." He crossed the room and knelt before her, trying to catch her eye. "Clara, look at me. That is the most foolish thing I have ever heard."
"It is the only thing to do,"
she insisted, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek.
"I cannot be the reason for your ruin. I will not be—"
He saw the genuine self-sacrificing despair in her eyes, and the last of his control snapped. He stood up, his fists clenched, but his anger was not for her. It was for the world that had done this to her. It was for Finch, for Mrs. Gable, for every whispering, judgmental fool who had ever made her feel unworthy. "No!" The word exploded from him, a raw, ragged sound of pure defiance. He slammed his hand against the wall, the impact making the whole house shudder. "You are not leaving. This is your home. I am your husband." He strode over to her, grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip firm but not harsh. He forced her to look at him, his eyes blazing into hers. "Listen to me," he said, his voice shaking with the intensity of his emotion. "What those people think means nothing. What happened in your past means nothing. The only thing that matters is what is here, in this house. You and me." His voice dropped, becoming thick with a possessive, unshakable fury. "No one touches my woman. No one drives her from her home. No one—" He pulled her into a fierce, crushing embrace, his face buried in her hair. "You are not leaving," he whispered. "Ever." Their standoff, however, was not the end of it. The public confrontation had consequences. A few days later, the town marshal, a weary-looking man named Silas Croft, rode out to the ranch. He carried a summons. A formal hearing had been called by the justice of the peace, a man named Judge Miller, who also happened to be the town's preacher. The purpose, the summons read, was to inquire into the nature and legality of the union between Luke McGregor and Clara Davies, following public disturbances and concerns regarding potential coercion and misrepresentation. It was a witch hunt, plain and simple, dressed up in the language of the law. The day of the hearing, they rode into town together. A united front, the entire town, it seemed, was crammed into the stuffy, makeshift courtroom in the marshal's office. Mrs. Gable and her friends sat in the front row, their faces alight with sanctimonious glee. Judge Miller sat at a rough wooden desk, his face grim and judgmental. He called them forward. Luke and Clara stood before him, hand in hand. Luke's grip was a warm, steady anchor in the sea of hostile faces. The judge peered at Clara over his spectacles. "Mrs. McGregor," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "It has been brought to the town's attention that your arrival here was under unusual circumstances, that you were, in essence, a mail-order bride, fleeing some manner of trouble in the East." Clara felt a flush of shame, but she lifted her chin. "I answered Mr. McGregor's advertisement, yes." "And did you, in your correspondence, fully disclose the nature of this trouble?" the judge pressed. "Did you inform your prospective husband that you were a woman with a reputation?" Before Clara could answer, Luke stepped forward. "Her past is none of your business, Judge, nor is it anyone else's in this room. It becomes my business when it leads to brawls in the street and public accusations that disrupt the peace of this community." Miller retorted. He turned his stern gaze on Luke. "Mr. McGregor, the charge here, essentially, is one of fraud. That this woman misrepresented herself to you in order to secure a place of refuge. The question before this hearing is simple. Were you deceived? Did this woman coerce you into this marriage under false pretenses, hiding a past that, had you known of it, would have altered your decision?" The room was silent, every person leaning forward to hear his answer. This was the moment of truth. He could save his own reputation, placate the town, and disavow her with a single word. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't dare look at him. Luke looked not at the judge, but out at the sea of faces, his gaze sweeping over them with a quiet contempt. Then he turned and looked down at Clara, and his expression softened into something so full of love and conviction that it made her breath catch. He squeezed her hand. He turned back to the judge. "There was no deception," he said, his voice clear and strong, ringing with an unshakable certainty that filled the room. "I got more than I ever bargained for. I advertised for a woman who was hard-working. I received that. I asked for a woman of good character, and I received the strongest character I have ever known." He paused, his gaze finding Clara's once more. "You ask if I was deceived," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, as if he and Clara were the only two people in the room. "Judge, when I first saw my wife, I saw a woman who was hiding. She was trying so hard to be perfect, to be dutiful, because she was terrified that the truth of her was not good enough. The world had hurt her and told her she was broken, but I looked at her, and I did not see the darkness she was so afraid of." He took a breath, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw a light in her that she couldn't see in herself. I saw a strength she didn't know she had, and I saw a heart that was so full of love and goodness that she kept it locked away for fear of it being broken again." He looked back at the stunned judge. "So, no, sir, I was not deceived. I was saved. And if any of you have a problem with that, then your problem is with me." A profound silence fell over the room. The sheer, unvarnished honesty of his words had stripped the proceedings of all their self-righteous authority. "Mrs." Gable stared, her mouth agape. The judge seemed, for the first time, at a loss for words. He cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, and with a muttered, "This hearing is concluded," he banged his gavel, the sound ridiculously small in the vast, ringing silence Luke had created. The crowd dispersed in murmuring, divided groups. Some still shot them looks of disdain, but others looked thoughtful, even ashamed, as Luke and Clara turned to leave. A small, wizened woman with a face like a dried apple stepped out from the crowd. It was old Mrs. Hemlock, a widow who lived on her own at the edge of town and was considered by most to be half-mad. She reached out a bony, gnarled hand and laid it on Clara's arm. Clara flinched, expecting another insult, but the old woman's eyes, sunk deep in their wrinkled sockets, were surprisingly clear and kind. "Don't you mind them?" she rasped, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. She looked from Clara to Luke, and a small, knowing smile touched her lips. "He didn't talk about duty. He didn't talk about contracts." She patted Clara's arm gently. "You love, child. You don't endure. In a place like this, that's more than enough. It's everything." With that, she shuffled away, leaving Clara staring after her, the simple, profound truth of her words a balm on her wounded soul. "You love. You don't endure." They rode home in a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of strangers, or of tension, or of fear. It was the deep, quiet, unbreakable silence of a battle won, of a truth finally spoken aloud. That night, as they prepared for bed, the air, for the first time in months, felt different. It was heavy, humid, and still. The incessant, dusty wind had finally died. A strange, metallic smell was in the air, the smell of ozone, the smell of distant, coming rain. Luke and Clara stood on the porch, looking out at the western sky, where great, bruised purple clouds were massing on the horizon, lit from within by silent, flickering flashes of lightning. They stood for a long time, not speaking, simply watching the approaching storm. Then it came, a single fat drop of rain that splattered in the dust at Clara's feet. Then another, and another. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the prairie, a sound so long absent it felt like a miracle. And then the heavens opened. The rain came down, not in a furious, destructive deluge like the storm before, but in a steady, life-giving, soaking torrent. It hammered on the roof, streamed in silver sheets from the eaves, and turned the dusty ground into dark, rich-smelling mud. The sound was a roar, a symphony, a blessing. Luke held out his hands, palms up, letting the cool water run over his skin. Clara tilted her head back, closing her eyes, letting the rain wash the dust and the shame and the fear from her face. Luke pulled her into his arms, and they stood there on the porch, holding each other, as the first real rain in months poured down around them, washing the world clean and promising. At long last, a new beginning. The rain was a baptism. It fell for 3 days and 3 nights, a steady, soaking, and merciful deluge that saturated the parched earth and filled the air with the rich, dark scent of life returning. The world, which had been a study in brown and gray, was reborn in shades of tentative, hopeful green. When the sun finally broke through, it was a gentler sun. Its light filtered through a clean-washed sky. For Luke and Clara, the rain washed away more than just the dust. It washed away the last vestiges of the old world, the world of contracts and duties, of shame and suspicion. What was left was the hard, fertile ground of a new beginning, and they set to work cultivating it with a shared, unspoken purpose. Their days were long and filled with the kind of hard, satisfying labor that leaves the body weary but the soul content. They worked side by side, a silent, efficient team, together. They repaired the storm-damaged roof on the barn, Luke hammering the new shingles into place while Clara handed him the nails, their movements falling into an easy, practiced rhythm. They rebuilt the section of corral fence that had been flattened, their hands often brushing as they passed tools back and forth, each touch a small, quiet affirmation. Clara, with a hope that felt almost reckless, went to work on a ruined garden. The soil was dark and rich now, a world away from the powder it had been. Luke, without a word, tilled the entire patch for her, his strong arms guiding the plow, turning the earth in a way she never could have on her own. She found a small, forgotten tin of seeds in the general store on their next trip to town. Corn, beans, and hardy pumpkin, and she planted them with the care of a priestess tending a sacred altar. This was not a garden of duty. It was a garden of faith. Faith in the soil, in the sky, and in the future they were building together. The house itself transformed. The door to her old, water-damaged room was repaired, the window replaced, but she never moved back in. Her things remained in the main room, and her place at night was in his bed. The house no longer felt like his space that she was merely inhabiting. It became theirs. Her book of poetry found a permanent home on the small crate beside their bed, a pot of wild prairie flowers, gathered during one of her walks, sat in a jar on the rough-hewn table, a small but defiant splash of color against the plain wood. Their evenings settled into a new kind of ritual, one born not of obligation but of deep, quiet comfort. After supper, as the last light bled from the sky and the coyotes began their nightly song, they would turn to their separate, yet connected, tasks. Luke would bring in a piece of leatherwork from the barn, usually a saddle or a bridle that needed mending. He would sit in his sturdy chair by the fire, the tools of his trade laid out beside him, the rhythmic scrape-scrape of the edger and the sharp scent of leather filling the warm air. Clara would sit in her own chair opposite him, her mending basket or her book in her lap. She would read aloud sometimes, her voice a soft, steady murmur against the crackle of the fire. She read him poems of the sea, of ancient kings, and of love lost and found. And he would listen, his hands never ceasing their work, but his head cocked, his attention wholly on her voice. In these moments, the vast, lonely prairie outside ceased to exist. Their world shrank to the small, golden circle of firelight, a universe of two. And later, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, one of them would rise, and a hand would be extended, and they would go to their bed together. Their intimacy was no longer a storm of desperate discovery, but a deep, slow-moving river. It was a language of gentle touches, of quiet sighs, of a profound and certain knowledge of each other's bodies. It was the comfort of a hand finding another in the dark, the simple, solid presence of another soul breathing beside you. She had come here seeking shelter, and had found not just a roof over her head, but a home in another person's heart. One night, a few months after the rain, a full, silver moon hung in the black velvet sky, so bright it bleached the prairie of all color and cast sharp, dark shadows. The air was cool and still, and the house was quiet. Luke had fallen asleep in his chair, a piece of half-finished leather work resting in his lap, his head tilted back, his face peaceful in the dying firelight. Clara watched him, her heart swelling with a feeling so vast and powerful it was almost painful. She looked at his strong, calloused hands, hands that could calm a wild horse or fix a broken roof, hands that had held her with such fierce tenderness. She looked at the lines of exhaustion and worry that the drought had etched around his eyes, and the quiet strength in the set of his jaw. This man, this quiet, solitary man had stood before a town of hostile strangers and declared her his own, not with bluster or pride, but with a simple, profound truth that had given her back her own soul. He had seen a light in her when all she could see was her own darkness. A decision, as clear and bright as the moon outside, formed in her. It was time to shed the last piece of her old skin. It was time to give him the one thing she had always held back, the one thing she had sworn to keep for herself, the unguarded, unafraid truth of her own heart. She rose from her chair, her movements silent and fluid. She didn't wake him. Instead, she walked to the door and stepped out onto the porch, into the ethereal black and silver world of the moonlight. The cool air raised goosebumps on her arms. She stood there for a moment, took a deep breath of the night, and then turned back to the room. He was awake. His eyes were open, watching her, his expression questioning in the dim light. She walked to the center of the room, her gaze locked with his. The moonlight streamed through the open door, pooling around her on the floor. Slowly, deliberately, she reached behind her back and began to unbutton her dress. It was the plain, gray calico she wore most days, the uniform of her old life, the armor of duty. The dress whispered as it slid from her shoulders, pooling in a dark circle at her feet. She stood before him in her thin cotton shift, her form illuminated by the silver light from the door, her scars no longer things to be hidden in darkness, but simply a part of the landscape of her skin, mapped by moonlight. Luke had not moved. He watched her, his breath caught in his chest, his heart beginning to hammer. This was something new. This was not the shy, hesitant woman he had comforted, nor the passionate woman he had discovered in the dark. This was someone else, someone powerful and self-possessed. She met his gaze, and her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it filled the silent room with its quiet, unshakable conviction.
"I am no longer a duty," she said. "I am not a contract or a bargain or a respectable arrangement." She took a step closer, her bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. "I am desire." The word hung in the air between them, a declaration, a vow, a gift. It was the truth. Stripped of all its armor, it was the final, beautiful surrender. He rose from his chair and came to her, his own movement slow, almost reverent. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, not to embrace her, but to gently cup her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. His eyes searched hers, and in their gray depths, she saw an emotion so profound it made her own eyes well with tears. He swallowed, his voice a low, rough whisper, a confession he had held in his heart for months. "I have loved you since the first week you were here," he breathed.
I saw you standing on the porch, looking out at the horizon. You were watching the wind, and you looked at it. You looked at it as if it had once beaten you to your knees, but you were daring it to try again." He shook his head slightly, a look of wonder on his face. "In that moment, you were the strongest, most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I've loved you ever since." Her last defense, the final, secret fear that she was loved only for what she had become and not for what she had been, crumbled away. He had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. He had seen her pain and her defiance, and he had loved her for it, not in spite of it. A tear slipped from her eye and traced a path down her cheek, and he gently wiped it away with his thumb. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to their bed, and in the silver light of the prairie moon, they made love with a deep, soulful tenderness that was a prayer, a thanksgiving for a love that had been forged in silence, tested by hardship, and finally, blessedly, spoken aloud. They rebuilt their lives, and in time, they rebuilt their house. It was Luke's idea. "This is a sod house," he said one day. "It's sturdy, but it's dark. You deserve a house with windows, a house that lets the light in." They worked on it together, through the autumn and into the mild prairie winter. He cut and planed the timber for a proper wooden frame, and she helped him raise the walls. It was slow, back-breaking work, but it was joyful. Every nail hammered home was a nail in the coffin of their old, lonely lives. Every wall raised was a testament to their partnership. The house that grew from the prairie floor was smaller than most, but it was strong, and it was filled with light from the 2 new, large glass windows they had bought with the money from a good calf sale. One of the last things they put up was a small, framed photograph on the crate beside their bed. It had been taken by a traveling photographer on a trip to town. It showed Clara standing beside the new porch, wearing her old, dark blue dress. But the woman in the photograph was a stranger to the woman who had first arrived in Redemption Creek. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her hands were not clenched at her sides. And her eyes, the eyes that Luke had first seen as being too calm, too guarded, now held a deep, quiet light. They were not cold. They were not empty. They were the eyes of a woman who was profoundly and completely loved. They did not become rich. The drought had set them back, and the land was a hard mistress who did not give her gifts easily. They never became famous or important people in the growing territory. Their lives were small and quiet, and contained within the vast circle of the horizon. But their lives were rich in a way that money could not measure. One clear spring night, years later, they sat on the porch of their new house, a shared quilt across their laps, watching the stars which glittered in the cold. Clear air like a spill of diamonds on black velvet. The air was soft, carrying the scent of new grass and the faint, sweet perfume of the night-blooming flowers she had planted along the porch rail. Luke took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "You know," he said, his voice a comfortable rumble in the quiet. "I was thinking today, all the things a man does in his life, building a ranch, raising cattle, facing down storms. They all seem important at the time." He turned to look at her, his silhouette dark against the blazing tapestry of the stars. "But the best thing I ever did, the very best thing in my whole life, was answering that letter." Clara's heart felt too big for her chest. She turned, lifting his hand and pressing it to her own heart. He could feel its steady, rhythmic beat against his palm. She looked into his eyes, and her own were shining with a love that was as vast and as brilliant as the night sky above them. "In here," she whispered, her voice thick with a truth that was deeper than words, a truth that had been there almost from the beginning. "In here, I was never a stranger." Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let us know. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales from the frontier, and feel free to share your thoughts on Clara and Luke's journey.